Afghanistan has been striving for peace and stability for the last 40 years or so. But the post-9/11 era has dragged Afghanistan into chaos. However, around the last 17 years, presence of NATO forces failed to achieve the objectives they came for. After marathon discussion in Qatar on January 26, 2019, the US Taliban talks appeared closer to pact, setting out possible withdrawal of foreign troops from Afghanistan. Similarly, the several rounds of talks on 5th and 6th February have taken place in Doha and UAE, but all in vain. This peace process in Afghanistan, what shape it is going to take in future, will be discussed in today's pivot. To discuss today's issue, we have with us Amina Khan, who is pursuing her PhD at Quaid-e-Azam University in Defense and Strategic Studies, and she is an expert on Afghanistan issue. Welcome, Amina Khan. Amina Khan, we'll start with the current status of peace process. As we have seen that we have seen many meetings taking place in Doha, Qatar, and many stakeholders are also very active in trying to advance some kind of peace in Afghanistan. So what do you say about the current status of peace process?
Well, I personally feel that the kind of developments we've seen since last year to date have been unprecedented, and I think the momentum is very positive regarding the peace process. The kind of positive developments we've seen, as you mentioned earlier, whether it's been the Doha talks or the UAE talks or even the intra-Afghan talks in Moscow, have been very positive. And again, as I said, we've never seen anything like this during the past 17 years. However, although these are positive steps in the right direction, one needs to understand that the conflict has been going on for so long that it's going to take a lot of time for all the parties to come together and come to some sort of a compromise. So while the momentum is positive, I think one has to be very cautious, and the term cautious optimism would be, a good description of the current state of affairs regarding the peace process.
Right. When we look at peace process, we know there are many stakeholders that have stakes in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the region too. So what do you see, what are the prerequisites that are required to be while we are talking about peace in Afghanistan? What are the prerequisites for peace efforts in Afghanistan? Well,
I think one of the first prerequisites was to engage with the Afghan Taliban. And although it has taken the international community more than 17 years of violence and bloodshed to realize this, finally they have come to this conclusion that peace can only be achieved through direct negotiations, and that too with the Americans. So that's one of the first prerequisites that is being met. The second prerequisite is the demands of the Afghan Taliban, which continue to be in a limbo because the Americans and Kabul and the Afghan Taliban continue to clash on these principal issues that the Taliban have talked about, which talks about the withdrawal of foreign forces, amending the constitution and whatnot. Apart from that, another prerequisite is that the Taliban and Kabul have to come to the negotiating table. And as you know, the Taliban have been adamant for various reasons, particularly because they do not trust Kabul, that is the government of President Ashraf Ghani, and they feel that he cannot deliver. So while two prerequisites have been met somewhat, the third one, unless and until there are no direct talks between Kabul and the Afghan Taliban, peace will remain elusive.
You just talked about Taliban and Kabul. So it appears that as if Taliban are a different entity and Kabul definitely is a different entity. So what is the problem you foresee in trying to engage in engagement between Kabul and Taliban?
Well, first of all, from the Afghan Taliban side, as I just mentioned, there is a big mistrust between the two parties. The Afghan Taliban consider any regime in Kabul, whether it was President Hamid Karzai's or the current government of national unity, as a puppet government that doesn't really have legitimacy, and it does whatever it does on the say of Uncle Sam or the Americans, number one. Apart from that, the problem is that within President Ghani's government, there's a lot of division regarding the Afghan Taliban. There are many within his political party, there are many within the Afghan diaspora, and I'm talking about not only civil society, but particularly the different political factions that do not acknowledge the Afghan Taliban, let alone do they want to share power with them. So one of the biggest, I think, impediments to the peace process is national reconciliation in Afghanistan, because there is a big divide. And the fact that the Afghan Taliban do not trust what President Ghani says, and they feel that he cannot deliver. Although let me just mention here that the kind of offer that President Ghani made to the Afghan Taliban last year, which kind of set the ball rolling regarding the peace process, is unprecedented. No Afghan leader has ever accepted the demands of the Afghan Taliban, which led to the ceasefire. But again, there is that level of mistrust. And I think that goes back to the history of Afghanistan, where the different ethnic factions have always had a lot of mistrust amongst each other.
Okay. Before we discuss withdrawal of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, well, just since we are talking about Taliban, do you think Taliban have changed in their outlook towards, have changed in their worldview, or how the country should be run, about domestic politics, about various issues that the world actually criticized during the regime in Kabul?
Look, since I focus on the group, particularly since Mullah Mansour took over as the leader of the Taliban, now he's deceased and we have Mullah Haibatullah, the group has been going through a gradual change and they are evolving. And we've seen this particularly from the fact that they're the ones that wrote an open letter to the Americans saying we want to move towards the peace process. And then the same group that did not believe in concepts as a ceasefire, they had a 3-day ceasefire. Apart from that, they have changed their views, and I keep on saying that, it comes with a fair amount of suspicion, because you can't trust the group because of the previous policies they had, whether it was regarding human rights or women. But the group has obviously changed and evolved, and we've seen this in their direct negotiations with the US. We've seen this in their statements given in Moscow, where now when they talk about the Afghan constitution, they talk about human rights, they talk about Afghan nationalism, they talk about women's rights. And very recently, Abbas Stanakzai, who's the head of their political office in Doha, said that the group recognizes the rights of women, not only in Islam, but also in the Afghan political process. And they said that women are allowed to choose their husbands, they're allowed to education. They even said that they would accept a woman prime minister, since she can't be the president because of the constitution. Apart from that, the group also has a foreign policy now. They're engaging with countries that they didn't even, talk to before, like Iran, Moscow. So the group is evolving clearly. And also their views regarding the Americans, where initially they used to say we want the Americans to withdraw. Now they're saying that we will consider the Americans coming back to Afghanistan, but playing a different role.
Okay, Amina Khan, I'm asked to have a break. You'll be back after the break. Amina Khan, we were talking about Taliban's outlook. Actually that means Talibans have over the period of time have evolved, and now they are ready to maybe go on what American values are, the values dictated to them. They have kind of acceptance of that kind of, or democracy. So you think there going to be an arrangement where Taliban will be all what Americans want?
I don't think it's mostly the Americans. I feel that the Taliban have had to change. It's a forced change, because the Afghanistan of today is not what it was 2-3 decades ago. The people have evolved, although they have been in war and conflict, but the group, Afghanistan has changed a lot. So has the region. So I think the Taliban acknowledge that they cannot come into power the way they did 2-3 decades ago, and they cannot implement those policies that alienated them from the society. So I think this has been a forced change. And also, let's be very honest with one another. The fact that the Afghan Taliban are sitting in Doha, their children are going to mixed schools in Doha, shows that the group has had to change. And they, although they say that they would still like Islamic values and on the basis of Sharia, but I think there is going to be some sort of a compromise, and it's coming out in their statements, where they're giving categorical statements regarding this issue. And also when they talk about, a very important concept is, they never used to talk about human rights. They never used to talk about Afghan nationalism. And they keep on saying this. If you see their statements, they say that the constitution, while it should be Islamic, at the same time, it should recognize Afghan nationalism, Afghan human rights, and the rights of every citizen. So these are very important things. They're giving signals towards a visible change.
Another important thing that when we say, as you have already mentioned, that Taliban are an entity and there's a Kabul government in place. So there are, different difference of opinion about various things between the government and Taliban. Probably it is thought that if Taliban they take over, they'll actually take place of so many Northern Alliance people, or the arrangement that President Ashraf Ghani has in Afghanistan. So do you think every party will be satisfied with the whatever space it gets in the new arrangement?
Look, first of all, I think it's too soon to tell what kind of a arrangement we're going to have in Afghanistan. As you know, elections have been postponed to the summers. At the same time, there are these talks about an interim government. Now, it's very interesting that you've mentioned this, because in the recent intra-Afghan dialogue that took place in Moscow, all the opposition groups and figures that took part, including Hamid Karzai, including Hanif Atmar, who's contesting the elections, are very open to this notion or idea of an interim government, whereas the people sitting in Kabul now, who formed the government, oppose this notion of an interim government. So it's very debatable, and I think it's too soon to tell what kind of a structure we will have. But from my understanding and from the statements that are coming out from these opposition figures, who are very influential, by the way, is that they've been engaging with the Afghan Taliban. And I think the agreement or the structure that will come out in the future will be that the Afghan Taliban will not be in power completely the way they were before, but they will be a part of a structure. It might be a patchy structure, but they will be a part of the structure. They will not have complete control over, governance in Afghanistan. There will have to be some power sharing. But regarding the previous Northern Alliance, they are actually the ones that oppose the peace talks. For example, the Afghan intelligence is made up, the National Directorate of Security is made up of former Northern Alliance, and they're the ones that have always been opposed to peace talks, as well as any efforts that Pakistan has made in this regard.
How significant is the opposition to peace process, and the way you said former Northern Alliance? Do you think they can create a real hurdle for peace talks?
Well, the fact that they were the ones that created the first hurdle, when, if we recall in the Murray peace process, when they were the first official interactions that took place between Kabul and the Afghan Taliban, they were jeopardized when the NDS decided to disclose Mullah Omar's death. Which was an open secret, but the fact that they disclosed it right before the second round of talks just shows that, they're not willing to accommodate the Taliban. Again, as I say, let alone share power. Because if the Afghan Taliban come into the political spectrum of Afghanistan, naturally they will have to be accommodated politically. And a lot of political figures will suffer from this accommodation. So there is a significant faction in Afghanistan that opposes peace talks. And again, that is, whenever we talk about the hurdles, again, the biggest hurdle is unless and until the Afghan people are not united and have a united voice towards the peace process, there can be no peace. Pakistan, the Americans can only do so much. It has to be from within Afghanistan.
Do you think there is any power or any stakeholder outside Afghanistan which is opposing peace process?
Well, there are a number of elements. India, for example, I would say, has never been very keen or forthcoming when it comes to the peace process. You've had countries like Iran that have had their differences, ideological and religious, with the Afghan Taliban, but they've also realized that peace can only be achieved through talks with the Taliban. Similarly, the Russians as well. But India has been adamant when it comes to this regard, primarily because of Pakistan's relationship with the Afghan Taliban. But I think even now, there is a paradigm shift within the Indian policy makers, where they realize that peace is inevitable and that the Afghan Taliban, whether they like it or not, are a legitimate part of Afghanistan, and they will have to be accommodated. And you've seen certain positive movements from both sides. If you recall, when President Trump asked the Indians to play a bigger role and send some sort of military forces into Afghanistan for training, the Indians were adamant and said no. And the Afghan Taliban acknowledged this gesture and gave a statement saying that they won't let Afghanistan be used against the Indians. So there is some sort of a recognition on both sides of acceptance.
Yeah, we need to take a break here. We'll be back in a while. Okay, as before the break we were discussing opposition, one that we have a domestic opposition to peace process, like former Northern Alliance you mentioned. How significant is this opposition? Do you think the opposition is to an extent that it can fail the dialogues or peace process?
I think it is a significant factor that can certainly derail the process. I think it can derail the process for sure, but I think, you know, if the Americans push for it, because at the end of the day, the deal has to be reached between the Americans and the Taliban. Whatever deal is reached, if it is achieved, will be imposed by the regime in Kabul, because at the end of the day, Kabul depends on the Americans. But certainly, it will derail the process.
Okay. Since we are discussing the derailing of process and various opposition to peace process, what are the specific hurdles that we see that the peace process can have, and who are the potential spoilers?
Well, as I mentioned, I think again one of the main issues or the main hurdle or impediment to the peace process is national reconciliation within Afghanistan. Unless and until the Afghans do not come together and willingly and collectively move towards peace, there can be no peace. Apart from that, there are fringe elements within the Afghan Taliban who have been sidelined and who do oppose peace. But I think those are fringe elements that can be overlooked. And I think one of the another big spoiler is the presence of the Islamic State of Khorasan province. And we saw the way it spoiled the process when we had the 3-day ceasefire in Afghanistan during the first Eid. There was no violence. The only violence that was committed, the huge 2 suicide attacks, were committed by the ISKP. So this just shows that the ISKP has a lot to gain from the continuation of this violence. And if peace is achieved between the Afghan Taliban and Kabul, at least that will be a united front in fighting the ISKP. So that's another big hurdle. And then, of course, you've got regional elements that do benefit from the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan.
Since you mentioned in your answer about the regional powers, I would just like to ask you, what interests regional powers like Iran? We have Afghanistan, India, we have China at the moment, which desires peace in Afghanistan because of obvious economic reasons. So what are the role of regional powers in peace process?
I think this is for the first time in the history of the region where all the principal regional countries, rather the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, that is Pakistan, China, the Central Asian states, Iran and Russia, where they're all on the same page, despite their previous differences. And if we go back to, you know, the history of Afghanistan, Iran supported the Northern Alliance, you had the Russians who supported, you know, the other groups, and you had Pakistan who supported the Taliban. But now this is for the first time where all Afghanistan's immediate neighbors have one view towards Afghanistan, which is the peace process, the recognition of the Afghan Taliban, and also for the region to take ownership, to play a more instrumental role, and lastly, to fight the ISKP. Because the Iranians, the biggest issue for them is the growing presence of the Daesh on both sides of the border. Similarly, the Russians also fear the growing threat of the ISKP. And of course, then you've got China as well that fears this whole terrorism aspect going into their Xinjiang province in the ETIM and whatnot. So I think regional countries have a very important role to play. And the fact that it was not the Americans, but the same Russians that invaded Afghanistan, they brought not only the Taliban to the negotiating table, but they also were the first to host the intra-Afghan dialogue, where the Afghan Taliban sat opposite fellow Afghans and they discussed the future of Afghanistan.
Okay, Amina Khan, this is very important that we discuss Pakistan factor in peace process, because Pakistan has, I think, the biggest stake in Afghanistan, peace in Afghanistan. So what do you see Pakistan's role in peace process, and subsequently we'll discuss what are the limitations that Pakistan has with regard to peace process in Afghanistan?
Well, look, I think it's an open secret, Pakistan's support and recognition of the Afghan Taliban. This has been in some way a blessing, but also it's been very detrimental for us, because anything and everything that goes wrong in Afghanistan, Pakistan is blamed for it. So if you recall, in 2014 and just before the US announced their withdrawal, Pakistan, in fact, it was Pakistan that coined this term that we support an Afghan-owned and an Afghan-led peace process. And we specifically, the state specifically said that they will support whatever Kabul does. But President Ghani, on his insistence, he came to Pakistan and he pushed Pakistan to use its influence over the Afghan Taliban. although initially Islamabad was reluctant, but because of President Ghani's push, the Pakistanis delivered. We brought the Afghan Taliban to the negotiating table in Murray process. Unfortunately, we just talked about it earlier, it was derailed and it was jeopardized because of the internal dynamics in Kabul, and we saw that in the reflection of the NDS. So Pakistan has used it's put pressure on the Afghan Taliban publicly and privately to come to the negotiating table. And I think Pakistan's played a very constructive role. The talks that have taken place, whether it's been in Doha or the UAE, where you had members of the Haqqani network who are still considered terrorists on the American list, they sat opposite Zalmi Khalilzad and they spoke. This is because Pakistan has been pushing the Afghan Taliban to move towards the peace process. And another very important point, Pakistan since 2001 has been saying the only way to achieve peace in Afghanistan is through a peace process and recognition of the Afghan Taliban. And it's taken 17 years for the international community to realize this. So I think Pakistan's stance has been very clear. It supports a peace process and it supports an Afghan peace process.
What do you see the role of media? We just normally discuss because these is very aggressive, right, rather offensive media these days. So what do you see the role of media in peace process?
Although I'm sitting here on a media platform, but I think that the role of the media has been somewhat negative. I think that particularly regarding the peace process, I think this is something that should be kept indoors and it should not be made public until some sort of or some sort of progress has been made, because as I said, media is also one of the biggest spoilers, particularly if you read the Afghan media, because unfortunately relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan have been on a downward trajectory for so long, it is always negative.
Amina, since we have less time for the program left, so I just would like to ask you briefly, what is the future of peace process?
I personally think that all principal stakeholders need to continue engaging. Dialogue is the only way forward, and they need to learn to compromise on their principal stances. But again, compromise and dialogue is the only way forward.
Thank you very much, Amina Khan. You came to our program and you discussed a very important issue that is being confronted in the region. And that's all for today. Until next week, Allah Hafiz.